Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My name is John Lustria, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I'm thrilled to be joined today by none other than Hilda Koontz. She's going to be giving a really excellent presentation about a perspective on mental health during the American Civil War. I think you're in for a treat today with this program. It should be really interesting. Before we get into that, though, I just want to say, number one, of course, if you like these videos, like this video, go ahead and hit the little like button wherever you're watching this, whether it's Facebook or YouTube. That lets us know that you are enjoying these. And if you want to go one step further, you can share the video, either just by telling people you know about it that you think would find it interesting, or sharing it out across all your various social media profiles. That helps us out a lot, gets more people viewing it. And that's an easy, free way that you can support the museum and these videos if you've enjoyed these over the course of the last year. If you want to take your support one step further, you can become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. There should be links in the comments, or you can do that at civilwarmed.org/support. And memberships go for as low as $25 a year. So it's equates to about $2 and some change a month, which is less than you pay for Netflix. So you can't beat that deal to support programming like this. So it would mean the world to us if you do sign up to join our membership base. We really appreciate those of you who have over the course of this very challenging last year. Your support allows us to continue doing programming like this. So thank you, and I urge you, those of you who haven't signed up, to consider it. So all of that being said, I want to turn it over to Hilda, and I think you're going to enjoy this one. Take us away, Hilda.
Thank you very much, John. The behaviors that are associated with mental illness, including those of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, have always been part of the fundamental human experience. But it took nearly to the beginning of the 20th century before there was any inkling whatsoever as to understanding the conditions, much less any sympathy for the patient, and not to mention there was no treatment. We now recognize PTSD as being a trauma and a stressor-related disorder. It occurs because of one or more traumatic events either inflicted upon the victim or merely witnessed by the victim. The trauma is caused by the actions of others, by an accident or an act of nature, and it can affect anybody, regardless of age, race, gender, or status. The symptoms include flashbacks of the event, being hypervigilant, aggressive, reckless, self-destructive behavior, and any reminders of the event will set those reactions off. It destroys cognition and memory and mood, and it can be diagnosed once the symptoms have been noticed for 30 days. It can have a delayed onset, and it can become chronic. Now, early humans, of course, did not have this information, but they did observe the behaviors. It's interesting to note that as early as 5000 BC, the Mahabharata Chronicles of India were being written, and they were talking about these symptoms. The symptoms are mentioned in the books of Deuteronomy and Job in the Old Testament. The Greek dramas are filled with scenes that give voice to the trauma that those soldiers had endured. And in recent years, we've become aware that a lot of those dramas were put on for returning soldiers from those Greek wars because they thought that perhaps it would help those soldiers reintegrate into civilian life. Of course, if you read Shakespeare, you know how much he talks about mental illness. Before the 20th century, a mental health issue was generally thought to have two causes. One was that there was an organic structural flaw in the body, or sadly, in one way or the other, it was your fault. This is called classic blame the victim. Depending on the time period, it was thought that it was because you were offending the gods, or you were worshiping the wrong one, Or perhaps you were possessed. Perhaps again, it was witchcraft. If you happened to be female, well, obviously you were just having a case of the hysterics. And if you were male, well, gentlemen, you obviously lack character. All you need to do is man up. Then they had totally made up diagnoses that were often used to inform the public as to what the cultural and the political norms of the day were. A particularly nasty one was a diagnosis that was called Drapatomania. Now consider this. This diagnosis was given to Black slaves whose only symptom was they tried to escape slavery. And after emancipation, the former slaves who exhibited symptoms of any mental illness were written off because of so-called evolutionary disease. Over the years, PTSD has been given more than 80 names. In 1678, a Swiss physician, Dr. Johannes Hofer, coined the term nostalgia to describe the depression, the anxiety, the insomnia of his soldiers. And the only treatment he could come up with was to send them home. The term nostalgia was still the term that was in use for those symptoms at the beginning of the American Civil War. The only other diagnosis for mental illness at the time was insanity. That was a catch-all term for the more extreme forms of mania and dementia. Medical knowledge simply had not caught up to the point of understanding that there actually is a science to mental processes that would explain human behavior. The Civil War, as we know, is the true beginning of modern warfare, and it was fought on a scale never before seen before in human history. The latest estimates are that nearly 3 million soldiers served in the two armies. There were over 1.5 million casualties, 750,000 of whom perished. Between frighteningly effective new weapons, mass frontal attacks, and wholesale slaughter, soldiers north and south were exposed to unprecedented intimate violence. Most of the soldiers were young. Most of them were from a rural background. And initially, their only concern was that the war wouldn't last long enough for them to see the elephant. Well, instead, we know it lasted 4 years. And neither the average soldier, the military, or the medical branch was ready for the challenge. The early exuberance of the war quickly dissolved into abject misery and a constant assault on the human body and mind. The troops were severely stressed because of abysmal food, constant marching, rarely having a decent place to rest, and seldom a chance for a furlough. There was, of course, rampant disease, and again, that unremitting, intimate violence. In June of 1864, Captain H.L. Patton of the 20th Massachusetts describes the state of his troops at that point in time. He says, quote, "The men have been so horribly worked and badgered that they are utterly unnerved and demoralized. They are easily scared as a timid child at night. You had a campaign of 1 day, we of 53 days. Every night under fire, every night, either digging or marching. For my own part, I am utterly tired and disheartened, and if I stay at all, it will be like a whipped dog." The mental toll on the troops was enormous, but neither the medical staff nor military leadership had any understanding of why morale, discipline, unit cohesion, and readiness were breaking down. The strain placed on the troops resulted in nearly 300,000 desertions. Some were so desperate to escape that they shot off fingers and toes just to get a discharge. During the war, both the Northern and Southern armies used the medical diagnostic system that had been developed by British Dr. William Farr. This classified the diseases of the patients, but the system did not include mental disorders. But nonetheless, dealing with the mental health issues still was going to be the responsibility of the medical staff. We really have to be fair to those people. They already had their hands full just trying to deal with physical injuries, and they themselves, nurses and doctors, were experiencing the same psychological symptoms. An estimated 10% of the nurses just collapsed. Many physicians either collapsed, they posted to less strenuous duty, or they self-medicated with alcohol to deal with their own trauma. Now, alcohol abuse was also a very well-documented coping mechanism in the officer corps. We know that 17 federal and 10 Confederate generals were either dismissed from service or seriously injured their careers due to the overuse of alcohol. And likewise, suicide was rampant in the officer corps. When you get in and start reading firsthand reports and letters of the day, it soon becomes very apparent that Generals Richard Ewell, George B. McClellan, George Pickett, Gouverneur Warren, and John Bell Hood were all relieved of duty because of the behaviors that we know now are textbook PTSD. In August of 1864, an aide to General Ulysses S. Grant said this, quote, "Grant is not at all well, and there are fears that he is breaking down." Indeed, he was, because unremitting stress degrades the immune system to such a degree that the victim is essentially committing emotional suicide. Soldiers who were diagnosed with so-called insanity, the more serious ailments, were sent to this place. This is the Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, D.C. In the official records describing nostalgia, they label it instead as a camp disease, and they note that these patients appeared with weeping, sighing, hallucinations, watchfulness, sometimes delirious, absence of mind, depression, frantic with terror. My friends, this is classic PTSD. Now, depending on the sympathies of the commanding officer, sometimes the remedies for nostalgia would include extra drills, make-work tasks. Once in a while, they got a little bit of entertainment. But other officers had another point of view. They said, well, to deal with this, what these men just need is another dose of combat. It's going to give them something to do, and it will definitely improve morale. Sadly, some victims were also harassed. They were shamed, beaten, and even executed for their behaviors. And by the way, in the early days of World War I, the British troops did the exact same thing to men with those same symptoms. Under this endless mental strain, enlisted men also committed suicide, or they actually invited the enemy to assist them. And that is shown very vividly in this painting by Winslow Homer. It's entitled, "Inviting a Shot Before Petersburg." As noted in the medical and surgical history of the Civil War, from 1861 to 1865, the Union Army repeated that they had had 5,213 cases of nostalgia, and they had diagnosed 2,600 cases of insanity. In the Confederate States Medical and Surgical Journal, we read of Virginia hospitals, quote, being oppressed with nostalgia cases. Referring to those official Union numbers, Assistant Surgeon Roberts Bartholomew said, quote, "These numbers scarcely express the full extent to which nostalgia influenced the sickness and the mortality of the Army." Now, from the point of view of 2021, we can never definitively know how many cases of PTSD there were during the Civil War, but we can do a rough estimate if we look at more recent figures that we have from the VA. Overall, the rate of PTSD during the Vietnam War was 15%. I would like to mention that in some years of that war, it was up as far as high as 30%. In the Gulf War, 12%. Iraq is 20%. Afghanistan, 11%. Please make a note, though, that in all these cases, we know for sure these numbers are undercounted. So if you look at these numbers that are sort of up to date, let's say conservatively, in an exposed population, we could expect 10% of the folks to develop PTSD. Well, for the Civil War, that would have yielded us 300,000 cases. Well, we've only got 5,213 noted on the Union side. Where were the unreported cases? Well, no doubt, a great number of them were in the ranks of the 300,000 deserters. An interesting fact is that 34,000 of the deserters on the Union side simply disappeared from hospitals. And we also know that there is a comorbidity factor of 60% if a soldier has a physical disease as well as having the symptoms of nostalgia. So what happened to the rest of these patients? Well, some of them were sent to local asylums, but quite often the overworked medical staff simply discharged them and sent them home. And some of these soldiers, you have to understand, were so disoriented that the Army actually put a tag on them indicating their destination, put them on a passenger train, and hoped for the best. By the middle of 1863, there were so many mentally ill soldiers just wandering around in civilian society in the North that there was a public outcry against the practice. We know that officially the war ended in April of 1865, but untreated mental illness in the veteran population caused a tremendous strain on the very fabric of American society. Post-war, we see huge increases in the rates of domestic violence, divorce, suicide, and general crime. And to make matters even worse, if a veteran had a mental health issue, they were denied their pensions, resulting in even more unemployment, poverty, and vagrancy. In 1861, there were a total of 40 insane asylums in the entire United States. They were designed then to hold about 100 patients. This one is the facility in Stockton, California, which opened in 1853. Interestingly, the pre-war model of therapy was something that was called moral treatment. It consisted of fresh air, exercise, good food, healthy activities, and kind treatment. And the improvements in the lives of patients was really quite good. However, admissions to those asylums tripled between 1861 and 1870. By 1880, there were a total of 140 asylums in the US, which were handling 250 patients each. And by 1900, that patient load had increased to over 1,000 per facility. Until late in the century, the asylums would only accept acute cases, so the chronically ill veterans were often sent to jail or to the poorhouse. And I can tell you quite truthfully, the treatment at any facility had disintegrated to such a level that it can only be described as obscene. In a thorough study of the Indiana Hospital for the Insane during the period, over 51% of the veteran inmates either attempted suicide or they actually killed themselves. Mental health issues, alcoholism, suicide were rampant in the Civil War veterans' homes. One visitor said when he observed this, quote, "It is such a sad sight. The degradation of souls of those old men is worse than the shooting of their bodies during the war." Some of the veterans would form little communes out west when they could get land. And at least that way, they said, they would have the support of the others when those flashbacks came over them. I know you're thinking to yourself, this is a totally wretched chapter. And yes, it is. But the Civil War was an important marker on the journey to understanding PTSD. Now, the medical community did not yet understand mental processes, but the surgeons had seen so many cases of nostalgia, and they had experienced it themselves, that they at least had a heightened awareness of the matter. After the war, a Dr. Horace Porter said this, quote, "The life of our soldiers of the late war was one continuous hardship to the nervous system." Nevertheless, the doctors were still holding on to the idea that nostalgia had an organic cause. You may have heard of this condition being referred to as soldier's heart. Dr. Jacob DaCosta was one of the very first cardiac specialists in the war, and he referred to the phenomena as irritable heart. He did a lot of research on it, but of course, he never found a functional reason for the ailment. The field of neurology also had its beginnings during the Civil War. Those doctors were, similarly, misdiagnosing the effects of trauma. They kept thinking it had an organic cause. In the 1880s, some of those neurologists came up with an organic diagnosis for a psychological ailment which was caused by events like this. It's actually kind of traumatic just to look at that picture. These kinds of horrific rail accidents were very common in the mid to late 19th century. Now, obviously, people would be killed and maimed by them, but there were people who survived, and even witnesses to these events who begin suffering with all of what we know are typical PTSD symptoms. Physicians could find no organic reason for the symptoms, so they made up the diagnosis of railway spine because they thought, well, perhaps the spinal cord had suffered some sort of concussion to cause the symptoms. But you have to pause for a moment and consider, we had witnesses who were developing these symptoms. There's no way they could have had an organic cause. And by the way, the great writer Charles Dickens was in a railway accident like this, suffered from it greatly, and wrote about it extensively. In the last part of the 19th century, doctors and philosophers start to ponder the nature of the mind and explore explanations for human behavior beyond just organic causality. In 1889, French physician Pierre Janet said this, quote, "Traumatic stress is an illness of not being able to be fully alive in the present." Dr. Janet was way ahead of his time. The concept went mainstream in 1893 when Dr. Sigmund Freud published his theory that mental disorders were rooted in the unconscious. He called the ailment traumatic hysteria. He maintains it's caused by trauma, it is fueled by forgotten memories, and it is responsive to cathartic treatment. He said this, "Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences, and thus we see we're nudging medical thought towards a psychological model of causality." Less than 10 years later, during the Russo-Japanese War, battle-related stress symptoms were finally recognized by the physicians and the Russian military. They set up a forward hospital. They treated over 3,500 soldiers for what they called war neuroses. And of great interest, the great majority of them were able to return to duty. In World War I, this ailment was referred to as shell shock. In World War II, it was known as combat fatigue. But it was only after the enormous number of trauma victims during the Vietnam War and the lobbying efforts of the veterans afterwards that this condition was finally recognized as PTSD in 1980's edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Of special note, the criteria finally specified that this ailment does not just result from combat situations, but it can be caused by any traumatic event, military or civilian. So, here we are, 156 years after the Civil War. What do we know now about this condition? Well, first of all, we definitely know it is never, ever the fault of the victim. No one chooses this. We know that generally speaking, at any one given time, 8% of the US population, that's 26 million people, suffer from it. We also know, after collecting 20-some years of data, that we can predict that 40% of students who are involved in mass school shootings will develop symptoms of PTSD at some time during their lives. The bottom line is that no matter which war or traumatic event you study, it is not a matter of if we will have trauma and cases of PTSD, it's a matter of when and how many. Now, in a moment, we're going to explore, and I'm going to show you exactly what PTSD really is, how it affects patients, and how we're coming along with treatments. But I would be remiss if first we did not acknowledge the current state of the world. Sad but true, because of the pandemic, every one of us is experiencing microdoses of unpredictable stress all the time. The rates of anxiety, depression, trauma symptoms, substance abuse, and suicide have exploded. It's too early yet to tell how many cases of PTSD will develop. But unlike other years when I've given this lecture, this is not an academic exercise. This is our reality. Okay, now I have a question for you. What's the purpose of the human brain? Well, it is the most complex organism that we can possibly imagine. But if you wanted to, you could boil down the purpose of the brain to 3 words. Keep person alive. Okay. Now next, let's consider this scenario. Let's imagine it's a nice weekend coming up. You're out for a drive on a nice 2-lane highway in the country and everything is going wonderful. And then all of a sudden, you notice there's a semi-truck coming towards me. And it's in my lane. Oh my, what are we going to do now? Well, let me see now. I was reading an article in the AAA magazine a while ago, and they said in situations like that, you should yada, yada, yada. Unfortunately, folks, I can't see you, I can't hear you, but I'll bet you anything, half of you are laughing right now and saying, lady, by the time you got to the word AAA, it's too late. And you are absolutely right, because your conscious cognitive brain cannot possibly process a remedy fast enough to save your life. Well, aren't you lucky? The brain is going to send you a helper. This is what I call screaming person. And all of us have been screaming person many times in our lives. This is actually a diagram of what we call the stress reaction. It is also popularly known as fight or flight. In less time than we can even measure, the brain, in times of stress, will activate the body's stress response, releases a huge flood of hormones. The hormones will shut down the functions you don't need, ramps up the ones you do in order to save you from the oncoming threat. When the crisis is over, the hormones go back to baseline and life goes on until you need this life-saving response again. But there's a problem. Sometimes with trauma, those hormonal levels do not go down. Or when they do, they go down quite slowly. And then they soar upwards at the least provocation. And this process damages the mind, the brain, and the immune system to such a degree that the person is prone to all sorts of other medical issues. You recall a few minutes ago, we read that quote from General Grant's aide, in which he commented on the general's status and how concerned he and the staff were for his welfare. They had reason to be, because this is exactly what was happening to Grant. When somebody develops PTSD, the brain is damaged, and it continues to use this fight or flight mechanism. It keeps looping. It's like a computer loop. It won't shut down. And as a result, the patient is stuck there in that trauma because their brain can't process and get them to live and to enjoy now. They can't integrate those new experiences, and so they are stuck. In the past, the victims of trauma had invisible wounds, but now they are quite visible because we have the technology to see them. Less than 30 years ago, there was a truly seminal moment, not just in medical history, but in the history of humankind. You see, at that time, medical researchers were trying to study the processes of the brain. First, they had PET scans, and then they acquired functional MRIs. And for the first time ever, we could really look inside. We could see how the brain works, how it processes information. We could map the circuits of the mind. And now those invisible wounds are as visible as a broken leg is on an X-ray. Now, in a moment, we've got a slide here that I'm going to share with you, which is, there are 3 views of a PTSD patient who is experiencing a flashback in an fMRI scan. I'm going to apologize a little bit. The images are in black and white, but I will translate a little bit because of what the coloration will tell us about it. Here we go. Okay. Understand again, this is a patient who is experiencing a flashback in a functional MRI machine. First, we're going to look at photo number A. This is the highlighted area we really want to focus on. In the original, it shows it is intensely red. On the functional MRI, an intensely red area indicates enormous amounts of activity. The researchers expected what they saw in photo number A. That's the limbic area of the brain. This is part of our emotional brain. Strong emotions, like that truck coming at you, you remember, activate the amygdala in that area, which is the mechanism that warns us of danger and helps to activate fight or flight. Remember, fight or flight ramps up the functions you need to survive and shuts off what you don't need. So the researchers said, photo number A makes total sense. We expected that. Now we're going to move on to photo B. This area down here that they've got an arrow to in the original is again bright red, which means that it is extremely active. This is called the Broadman's area 19. It's in your visual cortex. Why is this important? When you see a new image, no matter what it is, but in this case, it was that oncoming semi-truck, it registers first right there in Broadman's. That's the doorway, as it would be, to your brain. And then the brain has to decide, what am I going to do with the image? Should I just ignore it? Should I memorize it? Should I do something about it? Well, in the case of the oncoming semi-truck, the brain did something. It ignited fight or flight. That's the response that's going to save your life. This is a seminal moment, folks, because the researchers were stunned by this. They didn't expect it. And it changed so much of what we thought we knew about PTSD. Before that, we always thought that when the person was having a flashback, it was a memory of the traumatic event. We were wrong. In this brain, which has been damaged by trauma, we see that it is rekindling in the brain the way a new image would kindle that area. It's not a memory. It's happening for the first time. It's happening now. Let me bring this story to life for you. It's years after the Civil War. Old Charlie's living in a Civil War veterans' home. The gentlemen are all at lunch, and one day at lunch, Charlie's eyes go wide with terror. He stands up, he screams bloody murder, he says, "Grab your guns, boys, they're coming for us." And he dives under the table, shaking with fear. His friends have seen this before. They do their very best to console him. And one of them says, "Ah, poor Charlie. He's just remembering Shiloh again." No, he was not remembering Shiloh. This image tells us he is experiencing just like it was originally. It's happening to him again. It's not a memory. It's a real event. And that is the essence and the terror of flashbacks. Now, the pictures we saw, A and B, those are the areas that fight or flight ramped up and said, "We need these desperately." The third picture is C. In this picture, there's the Broca's area, which in the original looks just like this, pure white, which means there's absolutely nothing going on. No activity whatsoever. Fight or flight, shut it down. Why is this important? This gets to be really important later on for treatment. The Broca's area, when damaged, is a problem for folks, for instance, who have had a stroke. They have difficulty putting thoughts and feelings into words because that's one of our speech centers. Why is this important for us in this discussion? This has to do with treatment. I'm sure lots of people know what talk therapy is like. It's very helpful for a lot of conditions, but it's not particularly helpful for PTSD patients, at least not as a first line of defense, because you see, that Broca's area, that speech center has been closed down. And so when a PTSD patient says initially, "I don't want to talk about it, I don't have words for it," they are not being uncooperative. They literally can't get there because the trauma damaged that area of their brain. Think of it this way. Let's say you go away for a vacation. You come back and you discover there was a terrible flood in your area and the only road and bridge to your house has been wiped out. You contact the Department of Transportation and they said, "Well, sir, we're really sorry about that, but it's going to be a long time before we can fix that area." And you're looking at the road that's out and your house and thinking, "How am I going to get there?" And that is what's going on in that part of your brain if you have been traumatized this way. So this now leads us to the next part of our discussion is, how do we treat PTSD now? Well, first of all, there is no magic pill. It's more like a constellation of options because, as you see, this is affecting a lot of areas of the brain. Less than 40% of the patients in the VA respond to traditional talk therapies or drugs alone. There are drugs, yes, that will help with anxiety and insomnia and depression, but they don't touch the brain. They don't fix it. The world of neuroscience, however, offers us not only understanding of trauma, but some treatment options as well. One of the more simpler ones is an EEG, that's an electroencephalogram. That measures the size and direction of brain waves, so doctors can determine initially, does this patient have PTSD or TBI, which is a traumatic brain injury. The waves and the direction vary with the ailment. Other treatments that we have now are EMDR, that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. We have neurofeedback. These techniques work on the brain circuitry, teaching the brain new brain patterns so the patients can reconnect with the here and now. As you look at these images, you're looking at the damage. We've got to do some reprogramming of the brain, literally. There are other kinds of treatments that also help. What we're doing is we're rebuilding neural pathways. Some of these activities include art, music, theater, outdoor activities, sports, dance, including interaction with animals. This is a picture of a gentleman who is participating in treatment at Saratoga Warhorse, which is in upper New York State. This program was developed by a Vietnam veteran in 2011 and has successfully helped hundreds of veterans. There's another treatment that's called Stellate ganglion block. That's a mouthful. This technique has been used for decades. They put an injection into that ganglion, which is, it's about here in the neck, except it's anterior to the cervical spine. It had been used for pain relief for decades. They discovered that if they inject an anesthetic into that ganglion, it interrupts the fight or flight response. Over 80% of the patients have been helped. The effect can last for months, and while that is going on, the patient can receive other treatment. This is receiving a great deal of funding from the United States Army. It is really, really helpful for those folks. In years past, the medical community could not see a visible wound, so they were confounded as to a diagnosis. They denied the program, they condemned the victim, and they left patients uncounted and uncared for. Major John McMurray of the 6th USCT summed up his sad post-war Civil War experience. He spoke for all the veterans of that time. He said this, quote, "I relive the horror every year of my life since. I had borne it all with a mighty small amount of sympathy around me." It's heartbreaking to hear that. Then there was no hope for them. Over the intervening years, we gained more understanding, we developed more treatments, and the research is intensive, and it continues to this day. It's very much like something that the American poet Robert Frost said. Good to keep this one in mind. He said, "I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." I thank you so much for tuning in today. If you would like to learn more about PTSD, the Medical Museum has put together a page on our website with links to the latest and most reliable resources. From the home page, you go to the Mental Health in Civil War Primary Resources page. There you will see links to the National Institute of Mental Health, the Mayo Clinic, and the VA National Center for PTSD, as well as the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. In addition, if you have individualized questions for me about today's program, please feel free to email John Lustria at the museum. He will forward it on to me, and I promise I will get back to you. This is an important and ongoing issue for our society. Thank you so much again for attending this event.
Thank you very, very much, Hilda. That was really excellent presentation. I know I definitely learned a lot listening to that. And exactly like she just said, if you have any questions for her, you can contact me. My email is john.lustrea, Lustrea, john.lustrea @civilwarmed.org. And I'll be sure and forward those on to Hilda. So I hope you enjoyed. If you liked this video, please like the video, hit the like button, hit the share button. All that helps out the museum immensely and is something that anybody can do. And if you really enjoyed the video or any of the videos we've done, please consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. All of that helps us out and lets us continue to bring programs like this to you on a regular basis. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and we'll see you next week. Have a wonderful day, everybody.